Hello, BookTube, and welcome to March Mystery Madness for 2024. This is a long-standing BookTube event designed to celebrate murder mysteries. I can't honestly say that I wait for it all year long because I love murder mysteries so much that I can't sequester them to their signature BookTube event. Some BookTube types of reading I can. I don't do any Western reading except in June on the Range, and I don't read any self-conscious, in-on-the-joke garbage except in August, for Garb August, for instance. But mystery novels, I can't. I couldn't possibly. I love them. I just love them. But I especially love March Mystery Madness when I get to talk about them every day. I have a reason to talk about them every day. Now, March Mystery Madness in 2024 is 9 years old. That is mighty old for a BookTube event. It's bigger than ever. It's more beloved than ever. More people taking part than ever. And it's really easy to do. There are all sorts of prompts and all sorts of extras and all sorts of... There's a Discord and a Goodreads group. There's all the extras that you could possibly want if you love to sink yourself into this kind of event. But as with most events like this, the simple yardstick for participation is, did you read a mystery in March? That's all. You do that, you're fine. You don't have to follow any of the prompts, anything like that. Just have to join us in our communal love of murder mysteries. I'm going to do that. As I've said a few times on this channel, I decided right away that my approach to March Mystery Madness this year will be to look at murder mysteries written in series and pick book number 9 and read it and then talk about it with you. And I'm going to do that regardless of whether or not I've read the series. I'm just going to plunk in on book number 9 no matter what. I'll probably... 30 days, I'll probably do a good half or even 2/3 of those days will be series that I do know. And maybe I never got to number 9, or maybe I got to number 9, haven't read it in a long time. It'll be fun. I think it'll be a lot of fun to do. It's a slightly different angle than most of my co-hosts are taking, I think. But before we start talking about murder mysteries, specific volumes, I always like to start March Mystery Madness by talking about the murder mystery just in general. What it is, why we like it, and also why it works. Why do murder mysteries work? How many people have I known in my life who intentionally skipped even looking at the headlines of news stories in the paper about murder and couldn't read enough murder mysteries? I've known so many people like that, so many of them. I had an old friend once who absolutely loved murder mysteries, consumed them. He'd take 4 or 5 to bed for a nice, long, languorous evening, all the afternoon into the evening, and just, they would be littered over him like pistachio shells. Of course, in his specific case, pistachio shells would also be littered all over him, but he used to read them and love them, and we would talk all the time, and I would say, well, you have any guidelines for these things? Are you worried about gore? Because I knew that in real life, if you so much as cut yourself shaving, he couldn't bear to look at you. And when I asked him that question, he said, oh no, the gorier the better. So what is it that makes these things work? One of the ways that you can ask yourself what makes a mystery work is to ask if there are rules. And you all know where I'm going with this. Those of you who've been with me before in previous years, I think this is my 7th year or 8th year co-hosting March Mystery Madness. We are going to the art of the mystery story, and we are turning to Detective Story Decalogue by Monsignor Ronald Knox, who came up with this thing almost a century ago, 1929. He came up with 10 rules for murder mysteries. And I read these at the beginning of every March Mystery Madness and talk about them a little, just so that we can think about it. That's all, because it's so much fun. Rules like this are always fun anyway, even when you're breaking them. As Monsignor Knox points out himself while he's giving you his rules. He points out some effective exceptions. I always ask, what do you think of these things? So let's go through them. And I thought, I'm not 100% sure of copyright on this thing, but I'm guessing that the introduction to Best English Detective Stories from 1928 is probably in the common domain. I'm going to risk it. I'm going to risk it for the biscuit. And we're going to read these things and see what they say. So, number 1, commandment number 1. The criminal must be someone mentioned in the early part of the story, but must not be anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to follow. And he elaborates. The mysterious stranger who turns up from nowhere, in particular, from a ship as often as not, whose existence the reader had no means of suspecting from the outset, spoils the play altogether. The second half of the rule is more difficult to state precisely, especially in view of some remarkable performances by Mrs. Christie. It would be more exact to say that the author must not imply an attitude of mystification in the character who turns out to be the criminal. In other words, the rule is telling us the criminal must be someone mentioned earlier in the part of the story. You can't have a whodunit murder mystery that goes on for 28 out of 30 chapters, and then the murderer in chapter 39 turns out to be a total stranger. You have to be able to, the whole time you're reading the book, you have to be wondering who the murderer is. Or you have to know, that's the first part, is that you have to be wondering who the murderer is. Or, in the second part of the rule, you have to be wondering internally who the murderer is if you're getting the thoughts of all the different characters. We're told it must not be anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to follow. Because that's the author lying to you. If the author is letting you follow the thoughts of a particular character, or many characters, well, the murderer is going to think about having committed murder. If the author lets you follow their thoughts and intentionally leaves that out, they're tricking you. Better not to do it at all. Even if it has been done well by Agatha Christie or by other authors whose typical gimmick, along with this rule number 1, is to give us a character who is the murderer but who does not know his own mind. That's always cheap. Better not to do it. Let's move on to rule number 2. Rule number 2 is emphatic. Emphatic in only a way that a Monsignor of the church could make it. This is not hypocrisy. This is exactly right. All supernatural or preternatural agencies are ruled out as a matter of course. Monsignor Knox's entire profession was a supernatural or preternatural forces, but no, absolutely not. Now, again, if you read murder mysteries, every one of these rules is going to come up with an exception. Exceptions are going to come straight to your mind that you like, that you really like, where characters do speak with ghosts or do have some sort of supernatural power. But he is saying absolutely no, and he elaborates. To solve a detective problem by such means would be like winning a race on the river by use of a concealed motor engine. And here I venture to think there is a limitation about Mr. Chesterton's Father Brown stories. He is well aware of murder mysteries. He knows that these rules are summoning to the mind of his listeners exceptions. He nearly always tries to put us off the scent by suggesting that the crime must have been done by magic. We know that he is too good a sportsman to fall back upon such a solution. Consequently, although we seldom guess the answer to his riddles, we usually miss the thrill of having suspected the wrong person. Then rule number 3. Rule number 3 is, a couple of these rules have fallen out of favor in murder mysteries. They aren't done anymore, so we don't have to worry about it. But maybe their equivalents are. Rule number 3 is not more than one secret room or passage is allowable. I would add that a secret passage should not be brought in at all unless the action takes place in the kind of house where such a device might be expected. When I introduced one in a book myself, I was careful to point out beforehand that the house had belonged to Catholics in penal times. Mrs. Milne's secret passage in the Red House mystery is hardly fair. If a modern house were so equipped, and it would be villainously expensive, all the countryside would be quite certain to know about it. Everyone talks about Milne's The Red House mystery. Everyone does. At the time, people were codifying murder mysteries because they were taking off as a genre because of the popularity of cheap editions. And so everyone takes a whack at the Red House murder. Everyone does, including famously Raymond Chandler. I mentioned a couple of times when I've reread these, I agree with this rule. It's no different than pulling a rabbit out of a hat, magic-wise. It's cheap. I've mentioned a couple of times that I read a murder mystery in which a character who was a businessman has a heart attack. He has a weak heart. He goes into the country to relax. He takes a country house and realizes that it was actually the home. What is meant by Catholics in penal times is that for a while it was illegal to be a Catholic, and big houses would have Catholic bolt holes. They would have little secret rooms in the house where Catholics could hide when the house was inspected. And I read a murder mystery once that was pretty effective, where the big payoff close to the climax was that the main character doesn't have much else to do with his time. He examines the dimensions of the house on the outside and then compares them with the dimensions of the house on the inside and intuits that there must be such a room. And you think, all right, the game is given up. But that particular mystery had a second room that was under the floorboards. And it worked. But you wouldn't want that too often, I don't think. Then rule number 4. No hitherto undiscovered poisons may be used, nor any appliance which will need a long scientific explanation at the end. So, a poison that miraculously puts you in suspended animation. No offense to Shakespeare, but a poison that miraculously puts you in suspended animation, or a poison that makes you go out of your mind, so that you can walk around and you can do things, but you don't remember it, and you're acting perfectly in character, and it's this particular poison that does that. Those things don't exist, so don't introduce them. And the same thing, of course, when the Monsignor was writing this, science had yet to be born. Basically, it had yet to be born. So he's saying, nor an appliance which will need a long scientific explanation at the end. This rule definitely applies in the sense of a scientific gimmick. Now, nanotech has been the bugaboo in a number of mysteries that I have read. Don't do it. If you're using it as a gimmick to get you out of your own plot hole, don't do it. It's the same as invoking magic. What is his? Here, let's move on to rule number 5. Rule number 5 is tricky. When I read this Decalogue out 8 years ago, I thought I would encounter lots of problems. I thought that I would get hate comments. It was one of my earliest realizations that, as I often say on this channel, I have fallen in with the right crowd. I've fallen in the crowd that you're not waiting to take offense. I had to get through the wrong crowd to get to the right crowd, but you're not waiting to take offense. You're able to see things in historical context and just talk about it. That's great. That's fantastic. I'm very happy about that. And we're going to need it for rule number 5, because rule number 5 is no Chinaman must figure in the story. Let's give the Monsignor a chance to explain, and then I'll explain as well. Why this should be so, I do not know, unless we can find a reason for it in our Western habit of assuming that the Celestial, that was a nickname for the Chinese, is over-equipped in matters of brains, but under-equipped in matter of morals. Notice he's saying, unless we assume that, because he's implying that you shouldn't assume that. Fu Manchu notwithstanding, you shouldn't assume that. I only offer it as a fact of observation that if you are turning over the pages of a book and come across some mention of the, quote, slit-like eyes of Qin Lu, you had best put it down at once. It is bad. The only exception which occurs to my mind, there are probably others, is Lord Ernest Hamilton's 4 Tragedies of Memworth. And I interpret this, I have always said, what explains this is not that Ronald Knox doesn't like Chinese people. It's any mysterious foreigner. It's any person whose nature gives the writer any kind of cheap leeway out of the realistic probabilities of the plot. So it doesn't have to be a Chinaman, of course. That was the example at the time. I believe that the Monsignor exonerates himself from any accusation of racism here. I don't know about him in his personal life. He might have been a racist, but I think his clarification of this rule makes it clear that he's not really, he questions the cheap stereotype of the ethics-free, mysterious Chinaman. What he's saying in this rule is anyone who fits that description. Anyone who's brought on as a way to give the writer an out. Again, examples will come a mile a minute. I might argue that the most famous example of this is Successful. It's not actually a mistake. I don't know why it didn't occur to the Monsignor. Maybe he just doesn't think about it. But the Sign of 4. Sherlock Holmes, the Sign of 4 is a perfect example of this, and it's not a Chinaman. It's a Tongaman. but it doesn't have to be that. It only has to be someone who, by their very presence, can stereotypically be used as a font of any kind of MacGuffin that will smooth out the plot. For instance, in the 21st century, in modern lazy murder mysteries, this would be the tech specialist. This would be the girl with the dragon tattoo. Your bank is not networked with your home insurance or with your the movie theater. There's gonna be a network. She's gonna fly her tattooed fingers over the keyboard, and suddenly, you know what I mean. That sort of thing is lazy. And I think, as I've said many times at the beginning of March Mystery Madness, I think all of these rules boil down to a guard against laziness. Don't be lazy. Let's move on to rule number 6. No accident must ever help the detective, nor must he ever have an unaccountable intuition which proves to be right. That is perhaps too strongly stated. It is legitimate for the detective to have inspirations, which he afterwards verifies before he acts on them by genuine investigation. And again, he will naturally have moments of clear vision, in which the bearings of the observations hitherto made will become suddenly evident to him. But he must not be allowed, for example, to look for the lost will in the works of the grandfather clock because an unaccountable instinct tells him that it is the right place to search. He must look there because he realizes that that is where he would have hidden it himself had he been in the criminal's place. And in general, it should be observed that every detail of his thought process, not merely the main outline of it, should be consciously audited when the explanation comes along at the end. I think this is very good. Again, your mind is going to be swarming with examples of that, of a character doing that kind of an unaccountable leap and having it be wonderful. Probably the most famous example in modern times would be Will Graham at the conclusion of Red Dragon, figuring out how, who, why, and where the Tooth Fairy is. That is a creepy moment. It is done wonderfully, and it's a leap that he can't explain, as Jack Crawford puts it in that book, earlier in that book. It's a leap that he can't explain. Maybe Harris thinks that it is explained because he has described Will Graham as someone who gets in the mind of these killers that he's hunting. But what the Monsignor wants to guard against here is excess, where you're investigating some sort of crime and suddenly you just get the whole solution come to your mind without ever being able to piece together why. That's boring. And that's cheap. Rule number 7. Which is also emphatic. The detective must not himself commit the crime. A very brief elaboration here. I hope that I'm not getting in trouble with the Knox estate. I don't believe there is one, but this is all done in fun. And if you, I'm judgment proof, but if you, because I'm a book critic, so it's not like I have bags of money. If the Knox estate is going to sue, I will just take the video down. But we're doing this out of love. This is I venerate this every year. Let's read the elaboration. This applies only where the author personally vouches for the statement that a detective is a detective. A criminal may legitimately dress up as a detective, as in The Secret Chimneys, and delude the other actors in the story with forged references. But if that isn't true, the detective must not commit the crime. I know of one major book that violates this rule. And of course, the only way you're going to be able to violate this rule is if you violate the earlier rule about lying about the thought processes of the killer. I know of one major book that does this, where the detective turns out to be the criminal. We don't know about it until the big revelation at the end. The detective is the most famous detective who's ever lived, and the criminal is the most famous criminal who's ever lived, and it turns out at the end of the book that they are the same person. And I hated it. Absolutely hated it. Not just because how it was done, but because it was done at all. So I agree with this rule completely. The detective must not himself commit the crime. Rule number 8. The detective must not light on any clues which are not instantly produced for the inspection of the reader. So in chapter 4, the detective must not look down on the ground and say, hey, what? Hold on, what's this? And then not tell you what it is. Because that's magic. Then that could end up being anything. But let's see what the elaboration here is. Any writer can make a mystery by telling us that at this point the great picklock Holes suddenly bent down and picked up from the ground an object which he refused to let his friends see. He whispers, ha, and his face grows grave. All that is illegitimate mystery-making. The skill of the detective author consists in being able to produce his clues, flourish them defiantly in our faces. There, he says, what do you make of that? And we make nothing. The whole point is that you're supposed to be able, theoretically, ideally, you're supposed to be able to put all these pieces together yourself. Before the detective does, before the elaboration at the end. That almost never happens with me. But sometimes it does. When it does, oh my God. When you're not able, it's been my experience that when you can't put all the pieces together yourself, or rather when you can put them together at the end of chapter 1. So it's either the author is working on that or they're not. Then rule number 9. The stupid friend of the detective, the Watson. Again, another indication that maybe the Monsignor is not familiar with Sherlock Holmes. Watson is not stupid. The Watson must not conceal any thoughts which pass through his mind. His intelligence must be slightly, but very slightly, below that of the average reader. And he elaborates. This is a rule of perfection, but it is not the essence of the detective story to have a Watson at all. It's not necessary to have a buddy. But if he does exist, he exists for the purpose of letting the reader have a sparring partner, as it were, against whom he can pit his brains. I may have been a fool, he says to himself as he puts the book down, but at least I wasn't such a doddering fool as poor old Watson. Uh, do you know examples of this? The detective's sidekick is worth a digression all by itself as a phenomenon. Uh-oh, baby, there's no room there. We'll just have to make room, won't we? We'll just have to make room. There you go. You're going to give them some March Mystery Madness Frida yoga? We've got one more commandment to go. Here, come down here and give them some Frida yoga. Oh, no, you're done. You don't want to give them yoga at all. All right. Let's see here. Let's finish up with rule number 10. Twin brothers and doubles generally must not appear unless we have been duly prepared for them. Again, a lot of these gimmicks are shop-worn by now. I don't think many murder mystery authors do them. I really don't think so. But at the time, in the 20s, and then in the 30s, oh my God, in the 30s by the million, by the truckload, it wasn't uncommon at all in a serialized pulp murder mystery for a twin or a double of some kind to show up mysteriously at the end. What? But it's not when you had no preparation for it. You've got to know that there's a double. You've got to know that at least there's a strong resemblance between two characters. I've seen that done really, really well, where a murder mystery author will take pains either to observe himself that two characters look very similar, or he'll have many characters note that they look very similar as a way of goosing up your suspicion that maybe the one is substituting for the other. And I've seen that played off, so that's not true many times. Wonderfully done. But what is the elaboration here? The dodge is too easy, and the supposition too improbable. I would add as a writer that no criminal should be credited with exceptional powers of disguise unless we've had fair warning that he or she was accustomed in making up for the stage. How admirably is this indicated, for example, in Trent's last case? And that is the end of our Decalogue. So it's heavy on the references to murder mysteries, not all of which are read anymore. Mrs. Christie is still read. But the Red Chimneys, the story of the Red Chimneys, boy, oh boy, that had such a healthy publication history. Once upon a time, I don't think it's in print anymore. But anyway, those are the 10 rules, and I want to know what you make of them. Like, for instance, in a 21st century murder mystery, you won't come across, a stereotypically mysterious, hands in his sleeves Chinaman. You won't come across anything like that, and thank God. Thank God that we're beyond that. But do you ever encounter anything like that? A mysterious old woman with a kerchief on her head and elaborate cooking all day long who's from the old country. Maybe 30 years ago, this would often be witchy women from the Louisiana Bayou or something like that. Something that will allow a bad author to fudge things, to not work things out. Do you ever encounter something like that? And how many of these things do you object to? The reason I keep rereading this is because the Monsignor and I are on almost the exact same ground here. I, of course, don't want any supernatural elements in my mystery. That this is a locked room mystery and you have exhausted every alternative because it was a spirit that did it. No, no. If you're taking me laboriously through the workings out of a locked room mystery and at the end you say it was a spirit, so there wasn't any way to do it. There wasn't actually any way to commit the crime. It was supernatural forces that did it. I am going to hurl the book across the room. Just so, and also same thing with fake doubles or with miracle MacGuffins of one kind or another, whether they're poisons or technological devices or whatever. How many of these things bother you? And also, when you hear this Decalogue read out, how many examples come to mind that flout these rules and are still good? Quite a few, I would imagine. So anyway, that's how we're going to start off March Mystery Madness. Now we have the ground underneath us. So from here on out, it will be the 9th book in a series. I don't know what order I'll do them in. I'm going to start tonight. But I'm going to wrap this up for now, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.